Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something really special. We're looking at a stack of sources, not about some sudden event, but about, well, a monumental moment in intellectual history.
It's a clash of titans, really.
It is. We are immersing ourselves entirely in Joseph Schumpeter's 1946 obituary of his contemporary and, you could say, his great rival, John Maynard Keynes.
And this source is it's truly remarkable. It's not a standard biography, not at all. It's this piece of sustained, incredibly complex intellectual appreciation and rivalry all wrapped into one.
So you have Schumpeter, right? The great theorist of dynamic capitalism, creator destruction.
The author of Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy.
Yeah.
And he's tasked with appraising Keynes, the architect of the managed economy. His goal was never just to write some simple tribute.
Yeah.
It was a careful dual judgment. On the one hand, a genuine, completely unambiguous tribute to Keynes' undeniable genius, his technique, his personal brilliance. But, and this is the key, it's coupled with a fundamental, profound rejection of his underlying political and sociological vision.
And that tension, that's really the mission of this deep dive. That tension between admiring the man and, well, fearing his ultimate legacy. We're not just reviewing economic formulas here. We're trying to understand the genesis of modern interventionist ideology.
Exactly.
Because Schumpeter argues that Keynes' most famous ideas, even the very structure of the general theory, they trace the conceptual aha moment decades back.
Way back.
Rooted in a specific vision of capitalism's failure that he formed right after the First World War. We want to know what Schumpeter saw as the true origin of Keynesianism and why that origin might be, more important than all the mathematics that followed.
Let's start with that complex judgment then, the admiration part.
Yeah.
Because Schumpeter, who was himself an absolute intellectual powerhouse, had this incredibly high regard for Keynes' natural gifts.
He starts the appraisal by really detailing the man's background, doesn't he?
Yes, he sets the social context right away. He notes the academic clerical background and that essential gentry element that was inherent to Keynes, educated at Eton and King's College, Cambridge.
So he's immediately signaling that Keynes belonged to this established, deeply influential English elite.
And that this was something Keynes himself valued quite a bit.
Yeah.
Schumpeter notes that Keynes had a very keen sense of the importance of hereditary ability. He even said Keynes himself stressed that ability runs in stocks.
Right.
Schumpeter regretted not having the time to probe the past of the Keynes connection more deeply. He found the man's sociological roots fascinating. I mean, his parents were formidable figures.
His father was an economist too, wasn't he?
A very eminent logician and economist at Cambridge, John Neville Keynes. And his mother was a dedicated public figure, a notable mayor of Cambridge. So this background gave him a very specific, highly cultured, and deeply English perspective of service and governance.
So that background gave him the social footing, but the raw intellectual horsepower, that was just indisputable.
Absolutely. Schumpeter makes a point of noting that in 1905, Keynes emerged as the 12th Wrangler.
Okay, we have to stop there. For those of us who don't know, what on earth is a Wrangler?
It's a crucial detail. The Cambridge mathematical tripos was, you could argue, the most rigorous intellectual competition in the world at the time. A Wrangler was anyone who achieved first-class honors in this, grueling examination.
So being the 12th Wrangler.
That meant you were among the very best. It showed not just, an innate aptitude for mathematics, but incredible discipline and sustained, intensive hard work. It was a clear mark of intellectual superiority.
So he had the hard science foundation. Schumpeter recognizes that this aptitude for math was the bedrock for the purely scientific part of Keynes' later work. He had the training.
He could have mastered any advanced technique he wished, precisely. And yet, this is the interesting part, Schumpeter immediately juxtaposes this immense talent with Keynes' fundamental aversion to pure theory.
He wasn't interested in theory for theory's sake?
Not at all. He wasn't interested in l'art pour l'art and science for art's sake.
Yeah.
He had the ability, but not really the patience for logical niceties when they didn't serve a practical end.
The ultimate pragmatist.
I think so. Schumpeter says that policy questions all but monopolized his brilliant abilities. He was far too intelligent to disguise logical refinements, but if a clear policy purpose justified a simpler, maybe even cruder argument, he would use it.
Okay, and Schumpeter makes a really revealing comparison here, doesn't he? He says Keynes would use arguments as crude as those of Sir Thomas Mun.
Yes.
Who is Sir Thomas Mun, and why is that comparison such a jab?
It's a very subtle but powerful jab. Sir Thomas Munn was a 17th century English merchant, a leading writer of the mercantilist school. Mercantilism, broadly speaking, believed national wealth was all about accumulating gold, maximizing exports.
I see.
So by calling Keynes' potential arguments as crude as those of Sir Thomas Munn, Schumpeter is implying that when Keynes needed a policy win, he was willing to revert to, say, pre-classical, protectionist, or overly simplistic arguments that had been analytically debunked by Adam Smith's time.
Because the end result, the practical implementation, that's what mattered more than theoretical purity.
That's Schumpeter, marking the difference between a pure scientist and a policy artisan, a master craftsman.
A master craftsman dedicated to the solution, maybe less worried about the material purity. Okay, so moving on from his academic side, Schumpeter details this non-political path and his just tremendous capacity for work.
It's a profound paradox. He was, as Schumpeter says, the most unpolitical of men. He wasn't interested in party politics or ideologies. His loyalties were solely to specific measures he believed in.
And this aversion to the messy political arena, to red tape,
It propelled him into this extraordinarily influential public role that just bypassed traditional political channels. Schumpeter observed that Keynes was never willing to accept anyone's leadership unless it was in support of a recommendation that he was championing.
and his capacity for work, juggling all those roles at once, Schumpeter calls it unbelievable.
It was phenomenal, truly. Keynes maintained a staggering workload for decades. He was the King's College bursar, managing the college's vast finances. He was a teacher. He was the primary editor of the Economic Journal for 34 years.
And a public servant and a businessman.
Yes, advising the Treasury, managing an insurance society, a successful investment company. He openly said in the 1920s he couldn't afford a professorship because he earned so much more on his side ventures.
How did he manage all of that?
Schumpeter explains it was through an intense, almost maniacal power of concentration. Whatever Keynes did, he did it with a mind freed from everything else. When he was managing King's finances, he was only doing that. When editing, only editing, it's a level of focus that's, well, it's hard to imagine today.
Yet Schumpeter also points out that this insane quantity of output sometimes came at a cost.
That's the penalty, isn't it? The penalty Keynes paid for his pace. Schumpeter suggests that the quality of his work suffered from its quantity and haste. Much of it lacked the last finishing touch. He even cites the treatise on money as a prime example.
His 1930 book.
Right. He calls it a shell of several pieces of powerful but unfinished work, very imperfectly put together. He sort of muses that if only Keynes had internalized his own teachers, Alfred Marshall's, craving for impossible perfection, his technical legacy might have been purer.
It sounds like he was always racing against the clock of immediate policy needs. But that role as editor, from 1911 to 1945, that demands immense stamina.
It really speaks volumes about his energy. He edited the Economic Journal for 34 years, not just shaping its general policy, but giving minute critical attention to everything from broad ideas to specific punctuation.
And Schumpeter has some extremely high praise for him here.
He does. He claims Keynes, the editor, has had no equal since Dupont de Nemours managed the ephemerides.
Now, when we hear Dupont and Nemours, we think of chemicals. That can't be what he means.
No. He's referring to the father, Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours. He was a leading figure in 18th century French physiocracy and economic school before Adam Smith. And the Ephemerides was this highly influential journal. So managing it required not just scholarly rigor, but political skill and intellectual leadership. Schumpeter's placing Keynes in that lineage. Not just an editor, but a true shaper of intellectual discourse.
The genius and the artisan, it's a perfect description. And his blend of moral courage and intellectual force really came to a head early on with his first great public success, The Economic Consequences of the Peace.
1919. Right after his abrupt resignation from the Treasury delegation at Versailles.
Right.
And Schumpeter treats this as a absolutely fundamental event. Many people had misgivings about that punitive peace treaty, but they kept quiet. Keynes being made of different stuff, he resigned publicly and told the world why.
And he just leaped into international fame.
Immediately. Schumpeter calls the book a masterpiece full of sound advice, sound analysis, pitilessly logical, yet never cold.
And he didn't just analyze the economics. He provided these powerful, unforgettable character sketches of the leaders. Clemenceau, Wilson, Lloyd George.
Yes, that's where the prose just soared. His portrayal of the tragedy of the peace and those character sketches rose to heights that had been trodden by few. But Schumpeter confirms the analysis was sound. The feat, though, was primarily one of moral courage
And opportunity.
and opportunity. He acknowledges that while courage is rare, it requires a specific moment. There has to be a unique opportunity for such a feat. The war and the failure of the peace provided Keynes with the perfect stage to launch his voice.
Okay, so we've established the man's undisputed genius, his character, but now we have to pivot.
We do. We have to get to the core of Schumpeter's philosophical rejection. Keynes's fundamental vision of capitalism, a vision that Schumpeter insists necessitated his entire later theoretical apparatus.
This is where the Obituary shifts from biography to intellectual history. It's where he traces the true origin of Keynesian interventionism. Schumpeter says that economics and the consequences of the peace was simple, but its sociological sketch. That was a revolutionary part.
It was a profound historical declaration. Keynes was arguing that laissez-faire capitalism, the system that dominated the 19th century, was essentially an extraordinary episode in history.
And that it had decisively come to an end in August 1914.
Right. This wasn't just some cyclical downturn for him. It was a profound, structural, historical break. The whole game had changed.
So if the episode was over, what exactly did Keynes think was disappearing? What were the background conditions that were passing away?
He identified two primary conditions that made 19th century capitalism work. First, the rapid, almost unprecedented growth of populations, which gave you ever-increasing demand in labor.
Okay.
Second, abundant, seemingly limitless opportunities to invest. These were constantly being regenerated by new technology, railway expansion, the conquest of new sources of food and raw materials around the globe.
So basically, the traditional engines of expansionary growth were running out of steam.
Or at the very least, slowing down dramatically. He was proposing a kind of structural, long-term stagnation.
And this stagnation view is crucial because it leads directly to what Schumpeter calls the bourgeoisie's fatal flaw, a critique of the very people who drove saving and investment.
Yes. Historically, saving was the primary virtue of the capitalist system, right? Without it, there's no investment, no growth.
Of course.
And that was true, Schumpeter says, under those old, buoyant conditions. When opportunities for profitable investment were everywhere, there was no difficulty about absorbing the savings of a bourgeoisie that kept on baking cakes in order not to eat them. Saving was heroic.
It was socially productive. It fueled real capital creation.
But once those opportunities started vanishing after 1914,
Everything changed.
according to Keynes' developing vision, the spirit of private enterprise was flagging, investment opportunities were vanishing, and bourgeois saving habits had, therefore, lost their social function. The persistence of this historical virtue, and here's the punchline, actually made things worse.
So saving became destructive.
It did. Because without profitable avenues for investment, savings just turned into idle hoards, which then created unemployment and depression.
That is a fundamental reversal of classical economic morality. It's not just that the economy was depressed, it's that the core virtue of the capitalist class thrift had become a social vice.
And that intellectual reversal is the key to Schumpeter's entire argument. He insists that this profound pessimism, this sociological sketch, established the origin of the modern stagnation thesis.
So Schumpeter's central historical argument is that the economic theory of the 1930s was simply a tool forged to support a belief about societal failure that was conceived much, much earlier.
Ideology first, mathematics second. That is his exact claim. He said, look at the 1919 work. We find nothing of the theoretical apparatus of the general theory. No specific functions, no multipliers. But, he says, we find the whole of the vision of things, social and economic, of which that apparatus is the technical complement.
The vision predates the analysis. Schumpeter is insisting that the general theory wasn't some neutral discovery about how markets work.
No, he says it was the final result of a long struggle to make that vision of our age analytically operative.
That sounds almost like he had a conclusion and was just searching for the intellectual justification.
That's the subtlety of Schumpeter's critique. He doesn't deny the genius of the analytical effort, but he repositions it. He says Keynes was determined to create a formal structure, a rigorous model that would prove, mathematically, that his deep pessimism about the future of self-regulating capitalism was true.
And the struggle was long because classical economics didn't have a simple way to model persistent involuntary unemployment.
Exactly. He had to break with the classical apparatus to make his pessimistic vision logically consistent.
Okay, let's follow that struggle then. To forge the tool, it led from the consequences in 1919 through the Tract on Monetary Reform in 1923, and then the Treatise on Money in 1930.
The tract on monetary reform already showed Keynes' intense focus on using monetary management for general economics therapeutics. And this focus was rooted in a very English concern.
Which was?
His conviction that returning to the gold system at the pre-war parity was a severe economic error that was more than his England could stand. He was already trying to identify the only parameter of action that seemed left to him, given how rigid wages and taxes were in the 1920s.
So he was already looking for levers the state could pull to manage the economy away from what he saw as disaster.
That's it. Even in the tract, the saving investment mechanism was a central concern. And the concept of liquidity preference, the idea that people hoard cash rather than invest, it's there in an embryonic form. He was building the apparatus piece by piece.
But the Treatise on Money in 1930 was his major research project, a huge 2-volume effort. And yet Schumpeter says Keynes just abandoned it, hull and cargo. Why? Why did such an ambitious piece of work fail?
Schumpeter calls the treatise Keynes a most ambitious piece of genuine research, brilliant and solid, but ultimately, from Keynes' own point of view, a failure. He concluded it had missed fire.
It missed a fire.
He felt he had failed to convey the essence of his own personal message, that pessimism about stagnation. He'd gotten himself tangled up in technical details like price indices and bank rates that were too similar to the existing classical doctrine. It wasn't radical enough.
It wasn't a clean enough break. He needed a new language to express the radical idea he'd held since 1919.
He had to be more radical, so he cut himself off, engaged in what Schumpeter calls the greatest intellectual effort of his life, and the result was the general theory of employment, interest, and money of 1935. This is the new, simplified, conceptual apparatus.
And this is where he introduced the structural components that define his name today. Schumpeter mentions the 3 schedule concepts. Let's make sure we define those.
Okay, so Keynes introduced 3 primary aggregate functions. The first was the consumption function. This just dictates how much of a community's income will be spent on consumption. It shows that as income goes up, spending goes up, but usually by less than the increase in income.
Simple enough. And the second?
The second was the efficiency of capital function. Schumpeter notes that Keynes just renamed this from a concept by Irving Fisher. This basically determines the incentive to invest, how much profit you expect to make from a new unit of capital. If expectations are low, investment is low.
And finally, the third, which you said links back to his earlier work.
The liquidity preference function. This is essentially the demand for cash. It describes people's preference for holding their assets in liquid form cash rather than investing it. If liquidity preference is high, interest rates have to rise to convince people to lend their money, and that chokes off investment.
And Schumpeter's reaction to this whole construction is, well, it's almost sarcastic admiration. He says, what a cordon bleu to make such a sauce out of such scanty material.
It is, isn't it? A cordon bleu is a master chef. Schumpeter is saying Keynes was a master intellectual artist. The material simple aggregates like total consumption and investment was theoretically simple, or scanty, compared to the detail of the treatise. But the way he linked these 3 simple functions together to show how an economy could get stuck with mass unemployment, that was a masterpiece of conceptual design.
The technical proof for the 1919 idea.
Exactly. But this new model came with huge limitations that Schumpeter highlights as critical weaknesses. He saw the general theory as very strictly short run.
Okay, what does that mean in this context?
This is maybe Schumpeter's most profound critique. Keynes' model, by its very design, only looks at short-run phenomena. Its applicability is limited to a few years at most. The pivotal restriction is that the long-term drivers of capitalism production technology, the quantity and quality of equipment, are held constant. They aren't allowed to change.
So by definition, the general theory excludes the very forces Schumpeter himself studied. The dynamic, disruptive, long-term process of creative destruction that defines capitalism.
Precisely. It excludes, as he says, all the phenomena incident to the creation and change in this apparatus, that is to say, the phenomena that dominate the capitalist processes. Therefore, the model becomes most nearly justifiable in periods of depression.
So it's the economics of depression.
That's what Schumpeter confirms. Professor Hicks later called it that. It's not the economics of ongoing, healthy capitalism.
And this short-run static focus, combined with that 1919 stagnation vision, it leads to this grim conclusion that capitalism just naturally tends toward breakdown.
It results in a stationary state that constantly threatens to fall apart, because if short-run expectations are low, the economy locks itself into unemployment. And Schumpeter connects this directly to anti-capitalist sentiment. He says this feature, naturally qualifies Keynes' theory for the role of rationalizer of anti-capitalist volition.
That is a harsh judgment, to call it a rationalizer.
It is. But Schumpeter saw Keynes' theory providing the intellectual toolkit needed to justify state intervention without having to use the old language of socialism or class struggle. He even compares it to Marx.
How so?
He says it differs only in the mechanism of failure. Marx saw capitalism failing because of class conflict. Keynes saw it failing because of internal stagnation and excess saving. But both provided a seemingly objective, rigorous argument for systemic breakdown.
So the analytical brilliance of the general theory acted as a rationalizer for political action against the laissez-faire system. Schumpeter definitely saw the political energy in the doctrine.
Oh, absolutely. The success of the general theory was fueled by its real or putative political implications. He says the book gave the intellectual justification that many post-war intellectuals desperately needed. These were people who had already renounced allegiance to the bourgeois scheme of life.
But they were still intellectually constrained by classical economics.
They were. They still had to pay respect to the virtue of saving and parsimony, which was upheld by figures like Marshall and Pigou. It was the last ideological pillar of the system.
And Keynes just smashed it.
Schumpeter says Keynes broke their fetters. Suddenly, here was this highly sophisticated, intellectually respectable doctrine that provided the framework to renounce thrift and embrace government spending. It was the perfect bridge doctrine for them.
And this political energy led to this phenomenon that Schumpeter calls the Keynesian school. He calls it a genuine sociological entity.
Yes, which suggests something that operates like a unified movement, not just an academic tradition.
Right.
He describes it as a group that professes allegiance to one master and one doctrine, and has its inner circle, its propagandists, its watchwords, its esoteric, and its popular doctrine.
He's saying that Keynesianism rapidly solidified into this powerful, almost religious movement in the academic world.
And its success was immediate. Why did it resonate so powerfully, so quickly?
Because the doctrine gave simple, actionable advice. Governments should spend when markets falter. Advice that everybody could understand, that linked up with the notions of the untutored mind, but also satisfied the best brains with its technical complexity. And for the followers, the core ideological takeaway was that anti-thrift message.
Schumpeter's crystal clear on this.
Yes.
The disciples saw one thing above all else, an indictment of private thrift, and the implications this indictment carries with respect to the managed economy and inequality of incomes.
So the attack on thrift was the gateway to justifying two other major political roles: managed economies and income redistribution.
Exactly. Schumpeter notes that Keynes, the skillful advocate, always included qualifications and asides, but the political implications were unmistakable. He claims the doctrine, even if it doesn't say it outright, can easily be made to say two devastating things.
What are they?
First, that who tries to save destroys real capital, a complete flip of the classical virtue. And second, that the unequal distribution of income is the ultimate cause of unemployment.
Because if rich people save too much and investment opportunities are stagnant, their savings just flood the system and cause a depression.
Right, so redistribution becomes a cure for unemployment. This, for Schumpeter, is the essence of the Keynesian revolution, the intellectual and ideological shattering of that bourgeois pillar of saving.
Which leads to Schumpeter's final, profound concern: the separation of the man and the theory from the political application, from Keynesianism. He fears the legacy will endure even if the theory is proven wrong.
And this is the tragic element of the Obituary. Schumpeter concludes that even if critics successfully attack every one of his propositions, the overall structure will be resilient because of the power of the social vision it implemented.
So the political momentum toward a managed economy, which was justified by Keynes's work, might become irreversible, regardless of whether the math actually holds up.
Precisely. And he offers his final, powerful judgment, one that is both magnanimous and chilling. As with Marx, it is possible to admire Keynes, even though one may consider his social vision to be wrong and every one of his propositions to be misleading.
The genius is celebrated, but the social impact is feared.
That's it. The genius created a masterpiece. But that masterpiece was merely the technical justification for a pre-existing anti-capitalist stance.
Still, Schumpeter's lasting conviction is that the memory of Keynes the man, the brilliant scholar, writer, public servant, that will endure.
He believes the man's memory will outlive both Keynesianism and the reaction to it. But the political force he unleashed, Keynesianism, might continue to accelerate that trend toward managed systems no matter what. The vision became independent of its creator.
What stands out most here is that core conflict. Schumpeter honored Keynes the analytical genius, but he fundamentally feared Keynes the societal visionary. The brilliance of the general theory just masked that original 1919 vision, the belief that capitalism had run out of steam.
And this brings us full circle. The truth and applicability of Keynes' theories rest entirely on the accuracy of that stagnation vision he formed in 1919. The idea that laissez-faire capitalism, that extraordinary episode, had reached its historical limit.
And if Schumpeter is right, if capitalism has inherent dynamism and continuous investment opportunities,
Then the general theory isn't the economics of a permanent new reality. It's just a sophisticated model for a temporary depression. The truth of the math depends entirely on the truth of the history.
so, to truly understand the ideological roots of modern interventionism, to understand the basis for Keynes' deep pessimism, we have to examine the source Schumpeter identified as the genesis of the whole movement.
To understand the analytical apparatus, you have to first understand the conclusion it was designed to prove.
We invite you to join us as we begin an in-depth reading and analysis of the economic consequences of the piece from 1919. This is the document where Keynes publicly declared the old world dead and laid out the original vision that shaped 20th century economics.
We look forward to exploring that foundational text with you.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.